There is a sentence that sounds almost like a joke the first time you hear it, until you actually sit with what it's pointing toward. You cannot hire someone to do your push-ups for you. Think about that literally for a moment, because the literal truth here is the entire point. No amount of money, no amount of connections, no amount of outsourcing changes this specific fact. If you want the strength that push-ups build, you have to be the one doing them. There is no substitute, no shortcut, no delegation available for this particular category of outcome. Here's why this simple, almost obvious observation matters so much more than it initially seems to. Modern life has trained most people to believe that nearly anything can be outsourced, automated, or delegated if you have enough resources. Need a task done? Hire someone. Need a problem solved? Pay an expert. Need something built? Bring in a team. This mindset works remarkably well for an enormous range of situations, which is exactly why it becomes so dangerous when applied without exception. To the specific category of outcomes that genuinely cannot be outsourced, no matter how much you're willing to pay. Think about what actually falls into this non-outsourceable category, because the list is longer and more significant than most people initially assume. Physical strength, built through your own body, doing the actual work. Discipline, built through your own repeated choices to follow through despite resistance. Character, built through your own accumulated decisions across difficult moments. Skill, built through your own hours of deliberate, sometimes frustrating practice. None of these can be purchased directly. They can only be built personally through your own direct effort, regardless of how many resources you have available to spend elsewhere. Now, understand something important about why this distinction gets confused so easily in daily life. Adjacent to every one of these non-outsourceable outcomes sits something that genuinely can be outsourced, something related closely enough that the confusion feels almost reasonable. You can hire a personal trainer to design your workout program, but you cannot hire that trainer to actually perform the push-ups for you. You can hire a tutor to explain a difficult concept, but you cannot hire that tutor to absorb the understanding into your own mind on your behalf. The support around the outcome is purchasable. The outcome itself, when it depends on your own body or mind doing the actual work, is not. Think about how much money, time, and hope gets spent by people who have quietly confused these two categories, believing that paying for the support automatically produces the outcome, without recognizing that the actual work still requires their own direct participation, regardless of how much support surrounds it. Someone can hire the best trainer available, follow the most expertly designed program, and still not get stronger if they don't actually show up and perform the repetitions themselves. The expertise purchased was real and valuable. It simply never replaced the one component that could never be purchased in the first place. Now let's talk about why this confusion persists, despite being once stated clearly, fairly obvious. Part of the reason is that purchasing support genuinely does help, which makes it easy to overweight its actual contribution to the final outcome. A good trainer, a good tutor, a good mentor absolutely improves your chances of success, sometimes dramatically. But improving your chances is different from replacing your effort entirely, and somewhere in the excitement of investing in quality support, that distinction quietly gets lost, replaced by an unconscious assumption that the investment itself has done more of the actual work than it genuinely has. Think about a related pattern, worth examining honestly in your own experience. Have you ever invested significant money or time into something, a program, a course, a piece of equipment, a service, and felt a genuine sense of progress simply from having made that investment, independent of whether you'd actually done the underlying work the investment was meant to support? This feeling is common, understandable, and almost entirely misleading, because the investment itself, however well chosen, produces nothing on its own without the effort it was designed to support. Now let's talk about why this feeling of progress through investment happens so consistently, because understanding the mechanism makes it considerably easier to resist in the future. Investing in something, paying for a program, buying quality equipment, hiring an expert requires an actual decision, actual money spent, sometimes actual discomfort in committing resources toward a goal. That decision itself produces a genuine psychological response, a sense of forward motion, because something real did happen. The mistake isn't in feeling that response. The mistake is in assuming that response accurately reflects proportional progress toward the actual outcome, when in most cases, the investment has simply purchased the opportunity to do the real work, not the completion of that work itself. Think about the specific danger this creates over time, because it doesn't just affect a single purchase or decision. It can create an ongoing pattern where investment itself becomes mistaken for progress repeatedly, leading to a cycle of purchasing new programs, new equipment, new expert guidance, each one generating a temporary sense of forward motion, without the underlying gap ever actually closing, because the gap was never about insufficient resources or insufficient expert guidance. It was always about the specific personal effort that no purchase, regardless of quality, could ever substitute for directly. Now let's talk about what happens to someone caught in this specific pattern over an extended period. They accumulate an impressive collection of resources, books read but not applied, programs purchased but not completed, equipment bought but rarely used, expert consultations attended but not followed through on afterward. From the outside, and sometimes even from the inside, this collection can look like serious commitment to improvement. But look closer, and what's actually missing consistently is the specific, sometimes uncomfortable, personal effort that was always the actual requirement, regardless of how impressive the surrounding collection of resources happened to become. Think about how this pattern specifically avoids confronting the real requirement, often without the person even realizing that avoidance is occurring. Purchasing a new resource feels active, productive, even virtuous. It doesn't feel like avoidance in the moment. But if the pattern repeats consistently, if new investments keep appearing while the corresponding personal effort keeps failing to materialize, the pattern itself reveals something important. The investing has become a substitute activity, something that feels similar enough to progress, to satisfy the desire for movement without requiring the specific discomfort that actual progress would have demanded. Now let's talk about the specific discomfort being avoided here, because understanding it clearly helps explain why this substitution happens so consistently across so many different areas of life. The actual work, the push-ups, the practice repetitions, the difficult decisions, the consistent daily discipline is uncomfortable in a very direct, immediate way. Purchasing support around that work is uncomfortable in a much smaller, more manageable way, typically limited to spending money or time on the initial decision without requiring the sustained, repeated discomfort the actual work would demand across weeks or months of continued effort. Think about how this creates an almost irresistible incentive to overinvest in the purchasable support while underinvesting in the unpurchasable effort. Because the purchasable support offers a smaller, contained discomfort with an immediate resolution, while the unpurchasable effort offers a much larger, ongoing discomfort with no immediate resolution in sight. Given a choice between these two experiences, it makes psychological sense that many people gravitate toward the former, even when they genuinely want the outcome that only the latter could actually produce. Now, let's talk about what shifting away from this pattern actually requires, because simply understanding the mechanism, while useful, doesn't automatically produce different behavior on its own. It requires a specific kind of honesty applied consistently before making any new investment in support, resources, or expertise, asking directly whether the actual limiting factor in your progress so far has genuinely been insufficient support, or whether it has actually been insufficient personal effort applied to support you already have available. Think about how uncomfortable this question can feel to answer honestly, precisely because it removes the more comfortable explanation that insufficient resources were the primary obstacle. It's considerably easier to believe you simply haven't found the right program yet, the right trainer yet, the right method yet, than to accept that you've had access to adequate resources for a while now, and the actual missing component has been your own direct, sustained effort applied consistently to those resources. Now, let's talk about what happens once this honest question actually gets asked and answered truthfully. Because the answer, uncomfortable as it might be, opens up something considerably more useful than the previous pattern ever could. If the real limiting factor has been insufficient personal effort rather than insufficient resources, then the solution stops, depending on finding something external you don't currently have. It becomes entirely about applying something you already possess, more consistently, more directly, without waiting for some additional resource to arrive first. Think about how liberating this realization actually is, once you move past the initial discomfort of admitting it. If the problem had genuinely been insufficient resources, the solution would remain partially outside your control, dependent on finding, affording, or accessing whatever resource was missing. But if the problem has actually been insufficient personal effort applied to resources you already have, the solution becomes entirely within your control, requiring nothing external, dependent only on your own decision to apply that effort starting now, rather than continuing to search for some additional external factor that was never actually the real obstacle. Now let's talk about a specific example worth examining directly, because it illustrates this entire pattern clearly. Imagine someone who has purchased 3 different fitness programs over the past 2 years, each one abandoned. Within a few weeks, each abandonment followed by research into what might have been wrong with the previous program, leading eventually to the purchase of a new one, believing this new program will finally provide what the previous ones apparently lacked. Look closely at this pattern, and a clear question emerges. Were the previous programs actually deficient, or did each one get abandoned before it had a genuine chance to work, regardless of its actual quality? Think about how differently this person's situation looks once that question gets answered honestly. If the actual issue was inconsistent follow-through rather than program quality, purchasing a 4th program won't solve anything, because the 4th program will face the exact same risk of early abandonment that affected the previous 3, unless something changes regarding the actual pattern of follow-through itself, independent of which specific program happens to be involved. The push-ups required by any reasonably designed program are fundamentally similar. What differs program to program is rarely significant enough to explain 3 consecutive abandonments. What differs, more likely, is nothing about the programs at all, and everything about whether the actual work got done consistently, regardless of which program was technically being followed. Now let's talk about why this specific insight, once genuinely absorbed, changes how someone in this situation should actually proceed going forward. Rather than searching for a 4th program, hoping this one will finally be different, the more useful step is examining directly what caused the previous abandonments, specifically at what point they occurred and what preceded them. Was it a particularly difficult week that triggered a missed session, which then made returning feel more difficult, which then made the entire program feel less worth continuing? Understanding this specific pattern, rather than assuming program quality was the deciding factor, provides considerably more useful information for actually succeeding with whatever program comes next, existing or new. Think about applying this same kind of honest examination to whatever area of your own life currently involves searching for better resources rather than applying existing resources more consistently. It might not be fitness specifically. It might be a skill you're trying to develop, a business you're trying to build, a habit you're trying to establish. In each case, the same underlying question applies. Has the actual limiting factor genuinely been insufficient resources, or has it been insufficient personal effort consistently applied to resources that have actually been adequate for a while now? Now let's talk about what makes this question so difficult to apply honestly. In the moment, it actually matters, rather than only in hindsight, once a pattern has already repeated several times. In the moment you're considering a new purchase, a new resource, a new investment, the appeal of believing this specific one will finally solve. The problem is considerably stronger than the appeal of honestly examining whether the previous attempts failed due to resources or due to effort. Hope, in this specific context, tends to favor the more comfortable explanation, the one that doesn't require confronting your own pattern of follow-through directly. Think about building a specific safeguard against this tendency, something you can apply before the next purchase or investment decision, rather than relying purely on willpower to ask the harder question in a moment when hope is pulling strongly toward the easier explanation. One useful safeguard is a simple pause, built deliberately into the decision process, requiring an honest accounting of previous attempts before committing to a new one. Before purchasing the next program, the next course, the next piece of equipment, pause specifically to examine how the last several attempts actually unfolded, and whether the pattern points more toward insufficient resources or insufficient consistent effort. Think about how this pause functions differently from simply trying to remember to ask the question in the moment without any structure supporting that memory. A deliberate pause, built into the decision process itself, doesn't depend on remembering to be honest at exactly the right moment. It creates a checkpoint that has to be passed through before the decision proceeds, making the honest examination a required step rather than an optional one that hope can easily bypass when it's inconvenient. Now let's talk about what this honest examination typically reveals once it's actually performed consistently across enough decisions to establish a genuine pattern. In many cases, though certainly not universally, the examination reveals that previous resources were reasonably adequate, and the actual gap was in sustained, consistent application rather than in the quality or completeness of what was being applied. This doesn't mean resources never matter. Sometimes they genuinely are insufficient, and upgrading them genuinely does help. But the examination itself, performed honestly, prevents the automatic assumption that resources are the problem, an assumption that, left unexamined, tends to be reached far more often than it's actually accurate. Think about what changes practically once someone has performed this examination honestly and discovered that effort, not resources, has been the actual limiting factor. The next step isn't finding a new resource. It's applying the resource already available more consistently, starting immediately, without waiting for anything additional to arrive first. This might feel less exciting than purchasing something new, because purchasing something new carries the appeal of a fresh start, a clean slate, a renewed sense of possibility. Simply applying more consistently to what you already have lacks that same excitement, even though it's considerably more likely to actually produce the outcome you're after. Now let's talk about why this lack of excitement matters, because it explains part of why people gravitate so consistently toward new purchases rather than more consistent application of existing resources. New purchases offer psychological novelty, a fresh beginning untainted by previous failures. Continuing with existing resources means continuing in the same context where previous attempts already failed without the psychological reset that a fresh start provides. This makes continuing with existing resources feel, at least initially, less appealing than starting fresh somewhere new, even when starting fresh somewhere new offers no actual advantage regarding the real limiting factor. Think about reframing this lack of psychological novelty as something to work through deliberately, rather than treating the desire for a fresh start as a legitimate signal that a new resource is actually needed. The discomfort of continuing with existing resources, despite previous failed attempts, isn't evidence that those resources are inadequate. It's simply evidence that returning to a context associated with previous failure feels less appealing than starting somewhere new, which is a psychological preference, not an accurate assessment of what will actually work best going forward. Now let's talk about the specific role of push-ups themselves as a metaphor throughout this entire discussion, because returning to the literal image helps clarify everything discussed so far in more abstract terms. A push-up doesn't become more effective because you purchased an expensive new mat to perform it on, though a decent mat might make the experience slightly more comfortable. A push-up doesn't become more effective because you researched 16 different variations before performing your first one. A push-up becomes effective specifically because you performed it with your own body repeatedly across enough sessions to produce the strength you were originally after. Think about how directly this applies to whatever your own equivalent of push-ups happens to be right now in whatever area of life this discussion has brought to mind. There is likely a specific action, uncomfortable but entirely available, that represents your actual push-ups in this particular context. No purchase replaces it. No research replaces it. No amount of expert guidance replaces it, however valuable that guidance might be in supporting the effort you still have to provide personally. Now let's talk about a different but related excuse worth examining directly, one that doesn't involve purchasing external resources at all, but instead involves hoping other people will provide the missing motivation or accountability that feels absent internally. This is a subtler version of the same underlying pattern discussed throughout this message, because it doesn't cost money the way purchasing a program does, but it functions almost identically, outsourcing a component of the process that, in reality, cannot be genuinely outsourced, only supported from the outside. Think about the specific hope embedded in statements, "I just need someone to hold me accountable," or "I do better when someone's checking on me." These statements contain real truth. External accountability genuinely can help, the same way a good trainer genuinely can help. But notice the subtle shift happening underneath these statements, the quiet assumption that the accountability itself is what's actually missing, rather than the personal commitment that accountability was always meant to support, rather than replace entirely. Now let's talk about what happens when someone leans too heavily on this kind of external accountability, expecting it to substitute for internal commitment rather than simply reinforce it. If the accountability partner becomes unavailable, even temporarily, the entire structure tends to collapse quickly, revealing that the actual foundation was never internal commitment at all, but rather dependence on an external presence that was never guaranteed to remain consistently available. This is precisely why relying primarily on external accountability tends to produce fragile progress that holds up only as long as the external structure remains perfectly in place, collapsing quickly the moment that structure experiences any disruption. Think about the alternative, which isn't rejecting external accountability entirely, but rather building it as genuine reinforcement of an already existing internal commitment, rather than as a substitute for that commitment in the first place. Someone who has already decided internally to perform their own push-ups, so to speak, and who then adds external accountability on top of that existing decision, experiences accountability as helpful reinforcement. Someone who hasn't made that internal decision yet and hopes accountability will somehow create the commitment from nothing tends to find that accountability alone rarely produces the sustained effort they were hoping for. Now let's talk about how to tell, honestly, which category your own relationship with accountability actually falls into. Ask yourself directly whether you would continue the specific effort in question, even without anyone checking on you, even without anyone else aware of whether you followed through or not. If the honest answer is yes, then accountability is functioning as reinforcement, adding genuine value on top of an already solid internal foundation. If the honest answer is no, then accountability is functioning as a substitute, propping up an effort that doesn't yet have sufficient internal commitment behind it, which explains why that effort tends to collapse whenever the external accountability becomes unavailable for any reason. Think about what this honest answer reveals about where your actual attention needs to go next. If accountability is functioning as a substitute rather than reinforcement, adding more external accountability or switching to a different accountability method won't solve the underlying issue. What's actually required is building the internal commitment that was missing in the first place, the same commitment that no external structure, however well designed, can ever fully replace. Now, let's talk about what building this internal commitment actually requires, because it's worth being specific rather than leaving this as an abstract suggestion. Internal commitment tends to develop through the same mechanism discussed throughout this entire message. Direct personal effort, repeated consistently, generating its own evidence over time that you are, in fact, capable of following through independent of external monitoring. This evidence accumulates the same way it did with the specific excuse patterns discussed in earlier topics, building gradually rather than arriving all at once through a single decisive realization. Think about starting this accumulation with something small enough that external accountability genuinely isn't required to sustain it. A commitment so modest that following through entirely on your own feels realistic, even without anyone else aware of whether you did it or not. Success with this small, unwitnessed commitment builds exactly the kind of internal evidence needed to eventually sustain larger commitments. Evidence that couldn't have been generated by external accountability alone, because it specifically demonstrates your own capability to follow through independent of anyone else's awareness or involvement. Now let's talk about what happens once this internal evidence starts accumulating consistently, because it changes something important about how you approach every future commitment, not just the specific one where the evidence was originally built. Someone who has proven to themselves through direct experience that they can follow through without external monitoring carries that proof into new situations differently than someone who has never tested this capability directly. The proof doesn't guarantee success in every new context, but it removes a specific doubt that would otherwise need to be resolved before the new commitment could even begin. The doubt about whether you're the kind of person capable of sustained effort without someone else watching. Think about how much this specific doubt costs quietly in situations where it's never actually been resolved. Every new commitment gets approached with an unspoken question hovering in the background. Will I actually follow through on this? Or will it collapse the way previous unsupervised efforts have collapsed before? This question, left unanswered, tends to make the commitment feel more fragile from the outset, more dependent on finding the right external support structure before it can even be attempted seriously. Once that question has been genuinely answered through direct evidence, the commitment can be approached with considerably more stability because the foundational doubt about your own capability has already been addressed directly. Now let's talk about a specific application of everything covered so far, returning to the literal push-ups themselves, because the metaphor becomes considerably more useful once applied to a concrete situation rather than remaining purely abstract. Imagine someone who has spent considerable time and money on personal trainers, workout programs, and fitness equipment without seeing the results they were hoping for. Applying everything discussed here, The honest question becomes whether the actual limiting factor has been insufficient resources, inadequate programs, insufficient guidance, inadequate equipment, or insufficient personal follow-through applied to resources that were already genuinely adequate. Think about what this person's next step should actually look like based on the honest answer to that question. If the honest answer reveals that follow-through, not resources, has been the actual issue, the appropriate next step isn't researching yet another program. It's building small, internal proof of consistent follow-through, starting modestly enough that external accountability isn't required to sustain it, using whatever resources are already available rather than waiting for new ones. This might mean simply committing to a specific small number of push-ups, performed consistently without any new purchase involved at all, specifically to generate the internal evidence that has been missing throughout the previous cycle of purchasing new resources without corresponding follow-through. Now let's talk about why starting this specific and this small tends to work better than attempting something more ambitious immediately, even once the underlying issue has been correctly identified as insufficient follow-through rather than insufficient resources. Ambitious commitments, attempted before internal evidence of consistent follow-through has been established, carry a higher risk of repeating the same pattern that's already failed multiple times before, simply at a larger scale. Starting small specifically reduces this risk, making success considerably more likely on the first genuine attempt at building this internal evidence, which then provides a stronger foundation for gradually increasing the scale of commitment once that foundation has actually been established through direct experience. Think about how this entire process, applied consistently across whatever specific area of your own life currently involves this pattern, eventually produces something considerably more durable than any external resource could have provided on its own. The strength being built here isn't just physical, in the literal case of push-ups. It's the broader capability to follow through on commitments independent of external monitoring, support, or accountability, a capability that, once genuinely developed, applies across nearly every future situation requiring sustained personal effort, regardless of the specific domain involved. Now let's talk about the deeper truth this entire message has been building toward, returning finally to the specific phrase that started this discussion. You cannot hire someone to do your push-ups for you, and this isn't a limitation to work around through cleverness or additional resources. It's simply the accurate description of how certain outcomes actually work. Outcomes that depend entirely on your own direct, personal effort, regardless of how much support surrounds that effort or how many resources you have available to invest in preparation for it.